Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. Today we are going to start on a Mohawk mold of this skull that we made quite a few years back. As you can see here, the piece has sat in its bag for quite a bit and it's getting a little bit moldy. No problem though, we'll wash that off with some water. And for this mold we're going to be using silicone and eventually plaster. But let's start at the beginning. A Mohawk mold simply means a mold that has a cut that runs along the top of the skull and ends at the hairline around the forehead, essentially in the same place that you would find a mohawk of hair on a person. Mohawk molds are great when a sculpture is not destined for the foundry, as a Mohawk mold is well suited for plaster and less suited for castings in wax, which the foundry needs to create a bronze. Another alternative is of course to make a two-part mold and then cast your piece in wax or in bronze at the foundry, and you can find those tutorials on my Patreon page as well. Something like this skull though is for me really more of a demo piece and not something I'm going to be bringing to a foundry to have cast in bronze anytime soon. So therefore I figured it would be a decent piece to do a Mohawk mold demo on for you. What you are watching right here is the first step to making a really good, or what I believe to be a really good Mohawk mold. A big problem with Mohawk molds is that the spot where the cut ends at the forehead tends to rip and tear over time as the mold is opened and closed and used multiple times. Now you can of course glue silicone back together using silicone epoxy, but there is a better solution that we can implement here that will ensure that the mold never tears. By inserting a wooden dowel or stick into the end of the cut in the silicone, we will end up with a round section at the end of the cut. In other words, the cut will end at a hole in our mold. So we won't cut and then stop, we will cut until we reach where this wooden dowel is creating a hole in the silicone. And this is desirable, even though we do get a hole in our mold, of course, because a round section, like this wooden dowel is going to create, is never going to tear. When we open the mold, it will distribute the stress of the opening and spreading of the silicone, and a round negative form like this can take that sort of abuse really well. Now, I'm sure there are some math that could explain this for us, but I'm an artist, not a physicist, so you'll just have to trust me on this one and assume that I'm right here. A hole is drilled into the clay to accept the wooden dowel. It's easier, but not needed, of course, to use what's known as an auger bit, which is what I'm using here. And I'm hand drilling just to keep things under control. Now, the reason I like the auger bit is because it has this little screw at the tip of the bit, and this screw drives itself into the clay. It makes drilling a little bit easier, I think. And since this sculpture is very old and dry, I do want to limit the amount of force that I exert into it, so I don't have to push so hard using an auger bit. Pushing hard down on a drill bit on a clay piece that's as dry and fragile as this has the potential of cracking the sculpture, I think. Once the hole is drilled, I can insert the wooden dowel and use fresh clay to make sure the stick, the wooden stick, stays in place. I try to blend the edges where the stick touches the clay well into the rest of my surface and make sure that I don't have more of a scar there than I need to. I'll end up with a hole in my sculpture doing this, of course, or a hole in the casting rather later on, but that's going to be pretty easy to fix in the casting itself. As I mentioned, we'll be using silicone and plaster here. The first video in the series is going to focus on the silicone section. And the silicone that we will be using is RTV3325P from Blue Star Silicone or Elkem Silicone. I'm not sure which one of those two makes the silicone right now. This is a putty silicone that we are going to be applying by hand. It's very easy to use and produces pretty decent results. It's a very common process used here in Italy. And there are other options for silicones of similar types that you can use. And you can check out those on my FAQ post over on Patreon for more of those alternative silicones if you can't find the same one that I'm using here. The silicone comes with catalyzer and the mix ratio is rather flexible depending on how fast we want it to set up. You get 5 tubes of catalyzer for one 5 kilo bucket. Now, I've never done the math in terms of weight or volume to figure out the ratio. I just usually go by color. As long as the silicone is mixed properly and without gray streaks of uncatalyzed silicone, you should be fine. You mix the two components by hand, and here in the demo I'm not using gloves, but I do recommend that you use gloves. One of the problems using gloves is that the gloves tend to stick to the silicone a lot, which makes it very difficult to work, and you can solve that problem by using a bit of dishwashing soap on the gloves to help with the sticking issue. Mix the silicone and the catalyzer thoroughly until all the gray streaks are mixed out of the silicone. The color should be even and clearly yellower than the gray silicone in the bucket. With this sort of mixture, you can work for around 30 to 45 minutes, and it will take at most a couple of hours before you can apply another layer over the top of this one. I use a lot of water on my hands as the silicone does like to stick to everything, which is a good feature, but not when it sticks to your hand. And the issue of sticking can be solved very easily by simply adding water to your hands or to your gloves. Water keeps the silicone from sticking to your hands and allows you to work easily without making too much of a mess. Remember that if you're working with water-based clay, the water that you put on your hands will soften the clay, so try to keep the amount of water that ends up on your sculpture to a minimum. The first layer of silicone is the most delicate, of course, as we are dealing with the clay surface of our clay model, which we could ding or damage. In order to keep this from happening, I always keep the silicone between my fingers and the sculpture itself. I never touch the sculpture with my raw fingers. The first layer of silicone aims to capture the details of our surface, and there are certain things that we have to be careful with and aware of because of this. We don't want air bubbles or trapped water in this first layer, and the way to make sure that doesn't happen is to make the first layer rather thin. What I try to do is keep the edge of the applied silicone at the overall thickness that I'm after, so that I can see this edge as I'm working and I can sort of control how thick I make this layer. Ultimately, a thinner layer than what I'm doing here is probably a good idea. I'm laying it on perhaps a touch too thick to speed up the process, to be honest. And if this was a piece that I cared deeply about, I would go a bit thinner, almost so thin that the color of the clay would be shining through the silicone. Every new piece of silicone that is added by overlapping already applied silicone. This ensures that I'm always working outwards and never pushing air or water back into silicone that's already been applied. We always want to make sure that we push the air out of the silicone, and the best way to do so is to always work outwards towards the edge where we meet the clay. Always start in one place and grow from there. Try not to start from multiple places and grow them all at once so that they merge together eventually. Once the first piece of silicone is applied, then all the silicone will be applied outwards from there. I try not to mix a wild amount of silicone either. I mix a little less than I think I can get through in the allotted working time, and then I use it all without the need to rush. The problems that students face during this process occurs when you rush and try to do too much at once. It's better to keep it slow and steady and mix silicone twice rather than rush because the silicone is setting up on you too fast or faster than you expected. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast here. This layer is going to be covered by other layers, so ultimately the smoothness of it doesn't matter. Still, I do like to work clean, and if I have a really uneven surface, then the likelihood of ending up with an uneven thickness to the silicone skin later is much greater. It doesn't take very much effort or skill on my part to make sure that the silicone is well integrated into itself and somewhat smooth. This way, we carefully control the thickness from beginning to end, which leaves us with a decently even silicone skin thickness. Having an even thickness to the silicone skin is not super important, but it is rather nice when it comes to the longevity of the mold. So most silicones are going to shrink a bit, and an uneven skin thickness is going to shrink at different rates in different places. An uneven silicone skin is also going to have thin sections needing to support thicker sections. And this can lead to a section of the silicone being weaker, supporting more weight than it should, and then ripping, which of course would potentially ruin the mold. While I didn't do it here, it is very useful or helpful if the silicone is applied from the bottom of the sculpture heading towards the top. And this is especially true if you have a very long and tall sculpture. This is because of the water. If you apply from the top towards the bottom, then water will run down your sculpture and make the clay softer. This is if you are using water-based clay like I am here, of course. This means you're more likely to damage the clay sculpture, which means stopping and repairing it, or sometimes missing the damage entirely and then noticing it only later on in the cast, which means you have to repair it there. Either way, it means extra repair work, which we don't want to do.